Fantastic. So I'm hoping everyone can see a slide that says who moved my audience, with obviously a very sophisticated design palette applied to it. Yeah, before I start, I guess I'd just like to also note that I'm coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations or Indigenous people that might be with us today. So yeah, this is a talk that we, hopefully you're all here to hear, that, as Villavan said, will probably be about hopefully a little bit less than 20 minutes, and then a good prompt for discussion around who moved my audience. Yelling into the void, but strategically, how do we connect with the people out there in the world, given the state of the internet today? Just quickly, a little bit about me. My mum got this picture commissioned for my 40th birthday, I think. My partner said there's no way that's being hung up in our house, but I do use it digitally. So yeah, as Milovan said, I'm a master's student at Swinburne at the moment, but prior to that, have worked across government, education, in the design space, in this sort of digital space for a long time, helping a lot of different organizations try and figure out digital stuff, and also sort of in-house with in the not-for-profit sector quite recently, sort of helping with some sort of digital tool development and app development in that space. So I'm by no means an expert on all of this. I don't think anybody can be, but I guess I do have some sort of battle scars from certain things and some sort of questions to ask that hopefully resonate with people. I'd like to start with a few disclaimers. Yeah, I don't think any of this is going to be revelatory to anybody, and that you're going to fall off your chairs in shock. And so, apologies if any of it sounds like I am sort of, preaching to the converted. But hopefully, this is just a good sort of way of constructing the story around this. I will probably talk in a lot of absolutes. This is that, and of course, there are heaps of counterexamples to everything I'm going to say, and successful people who have managed to do things. But I think these are the sort of broad trends. Real data is hard to get on this stuff. This is actually one of the themes in the talk, so please take any of the charts that you see with a pinch of salt. We're talking very broadly about sort of communicating with people online, and I know we're kind of collapsing in a lot of different things around the way you provide services, the way you market services, the way you talk about events, the way you just listen to what your community is saying. Hopefully we'll be able to talk about a few of those things, but at the moment we're broadly just sort of saying, here are the ways that we communicate with the people that we serve or work with via the medium of the internet. I'm not going to talk about AI very much. I got to the end of this and thought, oh, that's probably a thing that might be of interest to people because it's obviously the hot button topic. We can talk about that if you like. There are some swear words in this presentation. Apologies in advance. So starting us off with the good news, right? There has probably never been a time in human history when the tools of mass communication have been so widely and cheaply available. We can all talk to a lot of people all the time, whenever we want, for very little money. The bad news is there has probably never been a time in human history when the tools of mass communication have been so widely and cheaply available. Everyone is talking everywhere all the time. So it can be really difficult to get our message out there, to get our voice heard, to reach the audience that we need to reach. So why is that? Well, I thought I would start with a brief sort of history of the internet. This is obviously going to be a massive caricature of a very complex story, and sort of present some things as quite discrete stages where they really aren't. This is obviously a big continuum, but I think there's a couple of sort of main beats that have got us to where we are today. Please forgive my very complex illustrations, but the internet, I guess, in the early days, we started with this idea that there was no Google, and it really was an internetwork of services and things. So finding something often meant traveling between cross-linked websites. There were small directories. There was a much more of a sort of community sort of structure to it, I suppose, where you knew about stuff because somebody else knew about stuff, or because you knew about your government service or your council. You knew who they were, and you sort of knew where to find them if they had a website. And of course, the internet sort of predates this idea of people having their own specific space on the internet or a website. They might have been on a community board. There might have been sort of messaging things. The internet could have evolved in very different ways, but we sort of landed on this idea that we should all have a website, we should have a presence, and people can come to us. Google arrived. We started talking about Googling things. There were obviously still people sort of outside that network, and people you'd still go to directly because you knew the URL, but more and more Google started to sort of swallow this idea of, if you wanted to find something, you used Google's tools. search was the way you got around, and we had the birth of this wonderful acronym SEO, Search Engine Optimization, the dark art of trying to guess what is going to put you further up the ranks with Google. And if there are any SEO people here today, I will say, again, I'm not an expert in that, but I have brushed up against it enough times to be wary of it, I suppose. After that, social media arrives on the scene. And at this point, okay, Google's still a pathway into a lot of stuff. Google obviously tries to get into the social media scene, but you've sort of got this new force to contend with of the algorithm. So it's no longer enough that your pages are, or your content is sort of well tagged and well written and well formed, for it to show up high in the Google rankings. You've also got to contend with this idea that there's a platform somewhere that's mediating your interaction with each other, and that has a bunch of rules. And we started to talk about content a lot at this point, of this idea of this sort of atomic unit of stuff that we're putting out in the world. And here's sort of where we are today. Everyone is everywhere and nobody is happy. And I just sort of want to, I guess, sort of point out that this is it is sort of a particular point in time that we're at. It is obviously always changing and emerging. We're never sort of on a plateau, but more than ever, we have this really distributed sort of scene where lots of different people are in lots of different places. People are in multiple places at once. Platforms are rising and falling with increasing rapidity. And it's really difficult to know how you're going to get your voice out there and how you're going to reach your audience in this kind of space. So I guess I just want to take us through some of the possibilities of how we're going to get through this, right? Or how we can sort of work through this in the current age. And again, this is what I'm really keen to hear about from all of you when we get into the discussion. So one option is we just concede to the mega apps, right? We go, all right, they own the game, they've set the rules, we need to learn to play the game by their rules. There's a number of reasons why that might be problematic. One, this one's up first because a few reasons. One, there's a lot of them. So, even though Facebook is, according to this graph, by far and away the biggest, it's a very dispersed landscape. People are all over the place. But the probably bigger thing to take from this is in all the small print down the bottom that you can't read, that essentially says most of these figures are made up. We don't know where they come from. Twitter's not on there because they won't tell us. What else? None of this is available for Australia, Canada, France, the United States. So we basically had to guess it. The point is all of this is incredibly fudged. So we see these sort of charts and we think, oh, maybe Facebook's the place to be or YouTube is where we should be. But it is very, very difficult to get a clear picture of where people actually are because the companies simply won't tell us that data in a way that is meaningfully comparable. And of course, we know a couple of just clipped headlines from the last couple of years that we sort of connect to each other through the whim of these companies, and they can take that whim can be withdrawn for various reasons. So we have all, I was working, in a charity at the time of the Facebook ban. It certainly impacted our traffic massively. I know a lot of other people providing even more critical services were massively impacted by that. So there is this sort of capriciousness to these big organizations that if we put ourselves in their hands and we hope that they're going to be the thing that helps us connect to our audience and our community, that they may withdraw that connection at any time. And, based on this idea is often as well that there are these mysterious traps that you can fall afoul of on these platforms. And, this obviously impacts people who rely on their livelihood with these platforms very heavily. That, there are a bunch of rules and we can't really tell you the rules, but if you violate the rules, we'll cut off your access. And there is this implicit idea that, well, if we told you what the rules were, you'd know how to circumvent them. So you just have to trust us that you've violated the rules. That is not actually a quote, but this is. So I won't read it out to you, but hopefully you all can read it from the screen. But there's this idea that on a given day, there are about 1,500 stories that could appear in a person's newsfeed on Facebook, and as many as 15,000. And this was in response to somebody complaining that their audience reach had just suddenly absolutely plummeted by 98%. And Facebook sort of shrugged and said, oh, well, there's a lot of content out there. So, maybe your content's not the big deal anymore. which I guess is just harkening back to that original point that there is so much stuff out there that the chances of your stuff getting to the persons who you want it to reach at the right time in the right place just diminishes all the time. And here's just a sampling of things that I managed to find that might sort of upset your position in the rankings with the algorithms by reading a bunch of SEO blogs over the last couple of weeks. And obviously a lot of these are sort of either very subjective, so they decide that the quality of your post is not good enough, or that what you're doing is not interesting to your desired audience. They decide that people who already look at your content are more likely to look at your content again, so we're not going to show it to anybody new. They decide that you're posting too much video or not enough video. Maybe you're not giving the platform enough money, you're not paying for ads and that sort of thing. So, this is a really tricky sort of landscape to make any really informed decisions in. And I thought I'd just really quickly talk, here's the sweary part about enshittification. Curious if anybody has heard this term before, if we can do a virtual Zoom raise of hands, but it is sort of moving more into the mainstream discourse, which I love. Cory Doctorow, who's a Canadian author, theorist, general sort of commentator, coined this term to talk about this idea that the platforms, sort of start with a proposition that they're for us. They move to a proposition that they're for the advertisers, and then they move to their last proposition, which is they're really just for their shareholders. And in this process, the experience that we all have on these platforms just gets worse and worse and worse. And there are examples of this where, I think everyone would probably agree that their Facebook experience might have started with a nice way to see what their friends were doing in a linear kind of chronological sense, and now is some weird swamp of mixed things about stuff. But there's also been evidence that people like YouTube, for example, have tested how many ads can we show to somebody before they watch content, before they absolutely drop off and just stop watching content. So what if we just gave you 20 ads before you watched a 30-second video? Would that be too annoying? Okay, that's a bit annoying. What if we dial it down to 15? So they're always looking for that sort of maximum benefit to them that will just be just enough to stop you from actually leaving, because the cost of leaving is really high, right? If that's where your audience is, it's where your friends are, it's where your family is, it's where your content is, it's very difficult for you to go somewhere else. So if we can't trust, or we can't really rely on the big platforms, there's this real temptation that maybe we should make our own. And this is where I really get to some generalizing territories. I want to sort of call out that there are successful examples of organizations creating their own online spaces. I think there are some pretty specific and unique circumstances that need to be true for that to be successful. But the big problems with making our own, one is that most of us, we just can't afford it. Okay, so this whole an app is for life, not just for Christmas. We tend to look at app development or building platforms online, building websites, creating anything in the digital space as these sort of projects, right? We get a project budget, we get a project timeline, we line out the steps on a Gantt chart, we chuck a bunch of money into it, and we build something. And hopefully it goes well. We get a nice brand and a logo, and it looks good. We put it on the screen, and we flick around, and we feel great. And we get to launch. And we say, job done, project's finished, all the money's gone, this thing's out in the world now, let it fly, it's going to do its thing. And of course, anybody who's ever been through this cycle knows that that is absolutely not the case, right? The work really starts, as in the case of a space shuttle, after launch. The whole point of launching something into the world is that now you have to look after it, you have to grow and nurture it, and that sort of thing. This is a very abstracted sort of chart from a personal experience of mine. So, a product was launched at a cost of about $500,000 that was funded philanthropically. The next year, there was no money, and it just sort of sat there and did its thing. I came on board about year 3 with a bit more funding, and correlation is not causation. It's not my fault that money went up and up, but the fact is building a team around that product, sustaining it, growing it, listening to user feedback, building advisory groups of actual sort of people with lived experience of the area we were working in, all this stuff costs money. And this is not money for innovation or new features or going crazy off-piste expansion. This was just money to actually keep the lights on and to kind of deal with the growing audience that we were having with this product. So this is a success story in the sense that usage was growing, interest was growing, but the cost of doing it was growing at the same time. And this was in a not-for-profit in a charity, in fact. So, you can imagine how you might approach funders and say, hey, you gave us 500 grand last year, we need another 500 grand this year, and in fact every year, if we want to keep the lights on this thing. So even if we can afford it, often we can't compete. This goes back to that earlier point, right? That we might have thought there's this vision from somebody, and when I say you, I probably don't mean anybody here who's got any experience of this, but perhaps a well-meaning but misinformed senior executive who thinks that if we get this amazing content and we build this wonderful portal onto the web, we can shove that content out there and all our users will flock to it like moths to a flame. Wouldn't that be great? Moths to a light bulb. But of course, the reality is your app exists in this, huge multiverse of other apps that are going on. And in this multiverse, there is a giant sucking black hole called social media, which is trying to consume all those apps and wants them at the other end of its funnel. So it's really difficult for anybody to kind of come into that space and make an impact. I won't labor any of these, but just some stats around, okay, yes, app downloads are growing every year steadily, although not exponentially. But this one here is, I think, the one that I try to put in front of as many people as possible. This is the retention curve for Android apps, again, based on a limited data set because this data is not widely available. But what you can basically see here is that within 7 days, somewhere north of 80% of apps are never used again. So you might get this sugar hit at the start, you launch your app, you feel great, you put it out in the world, you're going to change the world. 7 days later, basically, you've lost most of your audience already, and you're going to just continue to decline from there. This is what you never see, right? You see press releases around we've produced this amazing new chatbot, and it's going to solve X social problem, and we've got all this great positive user feedback and all this excitement. What's happening? Well, not even a week later. What's happening a month later? What's happening a year later? Are people still using it? Is it still getting that sort of traction? Again, there are definitely exceptions to this, but very specific reasons why those exceptions exist. And just in general, how people are spending their time, again, on their phones. So, if you are not in social media, photo and video, or games, you're basically fighting for this sort of leftover scraps of people's attention that they have and time on their phone. And that is a very competitive space. And the people competing in that space are much better at leveraging addiction and sort of dark patterns than we are, probably. So lastly, maybe we should stick to email. Good old-fashioned email, trusty old email. Nothing beats the direct approach. So great news. There are over 4 billion daily email users. So email's pretty widely spread. It's as ubiquitous as any other sort of web service there is. But 300 billion emails are sent every day. So I think that works out to something like 75 each for each one of those 4 billion users. And I don't know about you, but my email inbox is basically mostly useless these days because you basically spend all your time filtering out spam or not even spam, filtering out unnecessary email from people that are just telling you about transactions that you've had with them. So it's a very hard platform, again, to get cut through on. So where does all that leave us? Apart from thoroughly disheartened? Obviously, there are still ways to be successful in this space and people still manage it. You've all showed up here, which I presume has been at least in part through some way that we reached you through some sort of digital network, probably through some combination of a lot of different things. Good old Gramsci quote for every situation. I guess I do posit that we are in this spot right now, right? We've gone through the first 1, 2, 3 generations of what the internet is, and we are in this interesting spot now where a lot of stuff is sort of a bit morbid. It's still hanging around. Facebook is not the thing it used to be, but it isn't quite meta yet either. Less said about what's going on with Twitter, the better. And of course, AI and things blundering into the space and telling us they're going to transform them all, just like blockchains and NFTs were going to, but no one's quite sure how or why or where. So I've got 5 things that we might kind of think about and talk about after this, none of which involve AI. So one, and again, this is where we get into sort of the obvious territory, but this stuff is hard and it is ever changing. I don't think it is set and forget ever. And I'm really a huge champion of the value that comes from a good social media person, a good comms person, good strategic sort of media marketing folks, and really understanding what they do and the the value that they can bring. And if they're not able to articulate that, then maybe they're not a good one. But this ability to have somebody or some people whose job it is to really understand where your audience is and help the organization to think strategically about how they're going to go and find them and reach them, because it doesn't happen by accident and it's not set and forget. 2, people share stuff that they're in. I think this is sort of a really obvious insight that, again, often gets forgotten, is if you are, I don't want to sort of put government organizations sort of in the spotlight here, but often there is this sort of more old school voice of authority way of communicating with people that says, we are the service, you are the users of our service, and we're going to tell you what you need to know. There are often opportunities to flip that around a lot, get your community into the storytelling process, and not only makes that message more authentic, but often gets much better cut through. Related to that, maybe there is this opportunity to cede some control, right? So if it's not about dragging everyone into your house and saying, you need to come to my discussion forum, you need to come and use my app, you need to come to my Facebook group, what about opportunities exist to go into theirs? This is obviously comes with a whole lot of risk. It means often, ceding a lot of control over what the message is. It means participating in conversations where people might say things that you're not comfortable with. You do lose a lot of the ability to control the message. But when done, right, and with the appropriate sort of sensitivity to that risk, I think it is a really good opportunity to find those audiences where they are, instead of sort of demanding that they come to you to hear your sermons from the Mount. Again, a really obvious one, we all have scarce resources. This harkens back to the first point. You can try and be everything everywhere, but I think being really strategic about where you target is really important. There are little sort of subsections of this around, I talked briefly about video, too much, too little. Video can be a really powerful thing. It doesn't have to be expensive. Applied at the right time in the right place, that can be the thing that sort of catches people. But certainly not just sort of flooding the zone with content, and just trying to sort of think, well, I've got this post and I'm going to just produce it on every web platform that I have access to in the same format. Really thinking about understanding where the people that you want to talk to are hanging out and the kind of ways that you're going to reach them. And that chart is just another hangover of sort of monthly active users. It's a bit of a repeat of the top one, but understanding what this curve looks like for your audience. Again, you're never going to have a perfect view because you can't get that data, but at least a kind of basic understanding of the kinds of people that we talk to are more likely to be here than there. Some of them are going to be in multiple places, and what are the kinds of things that get cut through on those different platforms. And lastly, the real world's still there. So, although this is a focus on how do we reach people at scale with digital, and how do we use all these wonderful tools that we might have at our disposal, most of us still do talk to the people that we work with quite often. We have opportunities to be involved in the networks that they're involved in. And, there's a lot to be said to just word of mouth, to a poster in the right place, to a flyer. I think we're a long way from the days of, printing out thousands of printed collateral and mailing them out to people and handing them out. But that doesn't mean that, I've seen people sort of, I guess, neglect the opportunity to put up a poster in the right spot that might catch someone's eye at the right time, and instead try to have an awkward conversation about, oh, if you go to our socials, you'll see this thing that has this information. And if they just had it right in front of them there on a piece of paper, that would be a much shorter conversation, maybe with a QR code on it. So the very last bit I just want to talk about, and I realize I've already talked 10 minutes longer than I had hoped to. There is some sort of signals that I just want to poke to in the future, things that might be happening. I'm not a futurist. These are not predictions. I think these are just sort of signals that I'd like to sort of nod towards. And there's 3 of them. So these are probably a bit more narrow and not that relevant to people's lives at the moment, a bit more niche, but I think they will have potentially pretty wide-reaching implications for anyone who's doing stuff in the digital space. So the first one is the Federal Trade Commission in the US has a fairly, I don't want to use activist, but I guess a fairly sort of active head at the moment. And her name I forget, is starting to really stir this kind of antitrust pot in the US in a way that hasn't really been done in the last probably 30 years. So that is looking at these big organizations and saying, these are monopolies. They have too much control. The walls around their gardens are too high. You can't take your data with you when you leave, and we need to do something about that. And there are some interesting sort of lawsuits starting to wind up that might have some real implications for for how, for example, Facebook tells you about your reach to your audience, or even, the activity that's happening on their platform. The EU, of course, has been doing this for a longer time, and their focus often on transparency and privacy also might have massive impacts for, again, just lifting the hood on some of these algorithms and actually showing us what reaches who and how. And again, that idea of data portability and data sovereignty. So you as a user of these services should have rights to information that is created by you, but also that is created about you on these platforms. And the EU is pushing quite hard, I think. Not as hard as some would like, and definitely being sort of watered down all the time, but there is some pushing towards greater exposure there. And the last one is the Fediverse. And again, maybe a little informal poll about who's heard of the Fediverse. People might have heard of Mastodon, which is probably the most sort of famous example of the Fediverse. I don't know whether this is going to be something that completely transforms the world of the internet or just collapses is another great idea. But the fundamental principle behind it is that we're going to give you the frameworks and the networks and the tools, but we don't own any of them. It's not Facebook. It's a million Facebooks. You can spin up your own tomorrow. The BBC has started their own, for example. And really importantly, users are transferable between them. So if you want to join the BBC's own instance of Mastodon, you don't have to go and make a new account on the BBC's instance Mastodon that's locked to that instance Mastodon. You can take your account from not only Mastodon, but any of these Fediverse sort of services, and you can use that to sign into the BBC one. And that it really sort of centralizes the social network back on you as the user. And you've got a window into all of the different networks out there, rather than it being, Facebook, you have to go there. That's where Facebook happens. We'll see what happens with that. So, I guess the final conclusion to this, and I know I'm sort of like doing a bit of a gotcha undermining on the title that I came up with, but maybe the Israel didn't really move, but they did definitely spread out a bunch. And I think anything that we do to sort of try and address them just has to acknowledge that they are more dispersed than ever, but they're still out there, and we just have to be a bit more clever in trying to find them. That is the end of that. I would love to hear thoughts from you all.